Hello, fellow students of Jewish history. I'm sure that you are, like me, following the events in Ukraine with great trepidation. It's terrifying to see the impact of this cruel Russian invasion on a civilian population. And I'm specifically concerned for the health and safety of their remarkable president, Volodymyr Zelensky. And I'd like to take this opportunity to speak a little bit about his leadership in the historical context of Jews living in Ukraine. It is my small part to respond to his recent request that Jews around the world raise their voices in protest at what is happening in Ukraine right now. Zelensky's leadership is surprising and inspiring in so many ways. His heroism under these current circumstances, of course, has gripped the attention of the world, but it's also remarkable, especially to many Jews, and especially Jews in America and Israel, because of the prevailing stereotype of Ukrainian anti-Semitism. First of all, I'd like to provide some basic information on President Zelensky's biography. Secondly, I'd like to place his leadership in the broader context of the history of Jews in Ukraine, and to respond to the question of how unlikely is it for a Jew to be the leader of this country. And thirdly, I hope to achieve, in my small way, to contribute to the chorus of voices that are all praying for the safety of this leader, for his family, and for all the citizens of Ukraine that are suffering under this savage, unprovoked, and pointless attack. So first of all, who is Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky? He is 44 years old, president of Ukraine. Prior to his role as president of that country and really inspiration to the world, he was actually a comedian. He has been declared, however, the #1 target of Putin, the leader of Russia, and he has so far survived several assassination attempts. Now, Gail Beckerman wrote a fantastic piece in The Atlantic recently, and she wrote, what is remarkable, truly mind-blowing in the long sweep of history is that his Jewishness has not stood in the way of his being embraced as a symbol of the nation. Now, I will agree that Zelensky himself is remarkable and mind-blowing, but in the long sweep of history, I would say it's only remarkable and not necessarily mind-blowing to see a Jew in a leadership position in Ukraine. It has, after all, happened several times before that Jews have been within the very tight leadership of this country, particularly over the last century, and I'd like to kind of explore some of those details now. Zelensky's parents were in many ways typical for their generation. They were both highly educated, very urbanized, literate. His father was a professor of mathematics, his mother taught engineering, and note that they were specialized in non-ideological fields, meaning although they may have been very cultured and very engaged in other kinds of aspects of life, Soviet Jews, when they studied in university, they tended to gravitate to those fields which would be less vulnerable to critique. For example, you don't have a lot of university-trained Soviet Jewish historians because that tends to be a highly ideological field. Zelensky's parents were typical of a type of Jew that was known as Homo Sovieticus, or Soviet man, Soviet human. The idea was to try and keep your head down as much as possible, to not affiliate openly in any way with any organized Jewish entity, certainly not to attend a synagogue, because that was, during the very repressive era of the Soviet Union, the best way to get yourself on the KGB mailing list and to be exposed to all kinds of persecution, small and large, in the future. So they strove to excel and to raise their families quietly, but to stay away from anything ideological or political and so on. They were Russian speakers. This is also fairly typical of Jews because as a minority, Jews tend to sort of culturally orient themselves towards the dominant population, and Russians clearly dominated Ukraine for much of the 20th century. Zelensky himself was raised as a Russian speaker, his first language, but he adopted Ukrainian as his second language like many people of his generation. Actually, one of the things that I've witnessed in my own lifetime and over the course of my own visits to Ukraine, that it was, in the 1980s, clearly dominated by the Russian language, except in the western regions of the country. But now it's overwhelmingly Ukrainian speaking, and the Russians are in the minority. It's remarkable how that changed really since 1991 so rapidly. He also, Zelensky studied English, and he studied very well. He's actually quite fluent in the language. Let us not forget that he was only 13 years old at the time that Ukraine became independent, so he was an adolescent at the time when that cultural shift was happening. His wife is not Jewish, which is very typical for Jews in Ukraine, just like it is in the United States of America. It's a very high degree of intermarriage between Jews and Ukrainians. He went to school and he studied law, also typical for Jewish kids, although a little bit more ideological, particularly in the independence period. And then he went into comedy. He said he got involved with a comedy troupe that was called Studia Kvartal 95, or Kvartal 95, and this is also actually a very long Jewish tradition. But let's not forget that for much of Ukrainian history, Jews were much more urban than Ukrainians. They tended to concentrate in villages, in towns, and whenever they were allowed to live in them, in cities as well. And there were certain kinds of activities that Jews gravitated towards. Entertainment is one of them. You have a very long tradition of Jews in the klezmer music tradition. And Zelensky fits very well into that kind of paradigm of Jews in entertainment. We, of course, see that tradition in America as well, with Jews gravitating and in many ways creating Hollywood and the film industry and so on. His comedy troupe recorded a TV sitcom that proved to be extremely popular. It was called Sluga Narodu, or Servant of the People, and it ran from 2015 to 2019. Zelensky played a mild-mannered high school teacher in his 30s, still living at home with his parents, who was caught on a cell phone video in a tremendous rant against corruption in the country. That video was uploaded and became viral, and in the series Servant of the People, he ends up becoming elected to be the president of Ukraine. It's a hilarious sitcom. And then the great irony of it, one of those cases where art imitates life, imitates art, some Kvartal 95 employees decided to start a real political party with Zelensky at its head in 2018, and they ran on the platform of the fictional character Vasil Petrovich Holoborodko, who was elected in Servant of the People to be president, and Zelensky himself was then elected in a remarkable landslide to be the actual president of Ukraine. In the April 2019 election, he won 73% of the vote, which is just amazing. Now, it's not overwhelmingly amazing because here in this country, of course, we have Ronald Reagan, who was an actor who ended up becoming, one of the most memorable presidents of the 20th century. But Zelensky in Ukraine, that's his story. He made brilliant use of Instagram and social media to communicate his platform to ordinary Ukrainians, but those are skills that really served him well in the current crisis as well. Now, we see, though, that Zelensky himself is not just a TV character. I mean, it was hard for a lot of people, myself included, to take it really seriously that he was elected to this position, but he has really come into his own. And besides the obvious heroism that we're seeing in the current conflict, the Times of Israel published a really interesting interview with David Horowitz in which they write about the time when his own prime minister spoke poorly about Zelensky behind his back, what would be called in traditional Jewish thought Lashon Hara, and a recording of that was leaked, and then the prime minister, embarrassed, submitted his resignation. But Zelensky denied the resignation letter, saying that essentially, if he were to leave the government at this time, it would be very destabilizing, it would have a negative impact on the Ukrainian people. So this is a phenomenal demonstration of character, that he was willing to forego his own personal humiliation because it was really for the betterment of the nation. He truly was a servant of the people in that particular episode. Now let's try and understand a little bit more about how is it possible that Ukrainians could specifically elect a Jewish man to be the head of their government. Now, let us recall that why are we even asking this question? Primarily because here in the West, there is a deep-seated stereotype of Ukrainian anti-Semitism. I think it's especially true of children of Holocaust survivors who grew up in the diaspora for two reasons. First of all, because there was a certain degree of Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis. That is, of course, Putin's go-to line, which is absolutely absurd and offensive, that Ukraine needs to be denazified. That's ridiculous. But there is definitely a history of this that I've explored in other videos, a little more sophistication at length. The second reason for this, for the stereotype, is because Jews in the diaspora have been separated geographically from the normal day-to-day of Jewish Ukrainian life. I mean, look at it this way. Jews have lived in Ukraine. There has been documented Jewish life in Ukraine for well over 1,000 years. If you were to add up the years in which there was sustained violence from Ukrainians directed against Jews, and there were, of course, such moments of possible pogrom in 1113, the pogroms of 1648-49 under Khmelnytsky, the 1768 Haidamak uprising, of course, the pogroms of the early 20th century and the Revolutionary era, and then the Holocaust, which had Ukrainian collaboration to some degree with the Nazis. If you added up all of those years, however, you would only get to about 4% of the entire scope of Ukrainian Jewish coexistence. And over the much longer period of time, like 96% of those years, Jews and Ukrainians are doing business together. They are exchanging recipes. A lot of Eastern European cooking is essentially Ukrainian cooking. We're exchanging, linguistic terminology. Ukrainian Yiddish is heavily influenced by Ukrainian. Give you even in the most intimate of terms, like for example, in Yiddish, we don't call our fathers, Abba, which is the Aramaic and Hebrew word, or Av is actually the Hebrew word, but Abba is more common. We don't call them Vater, because that's like a German term, even though Yiddish is essentially German. We call them Tato or Tati, which is based on the Ukrainian Tato. And we can go on and on with so many words which are like kitchen vocabulary, home-based words that are really Ukrainian. Yiddish doesn't absorb those words unless Jews and Ukrainians are spending time as children in each other's kitchens, unless there is a significant amount, particularly through women, of cultural cross-fertilization. So, thinking about it in those terms, it makes more sense for us now to just stop talking about Ukrainian anti-Semitism, please. There is a place for that, but it's not here and it's not now. Let me just conclude this small mini rant with this particular Pew Research Center chart, which was conducted in, I believe, 2019, looking at the rate of anti-Semitism in various Eastern European countries. And in this remarkable study by a very reputable organization, it appears that Ukrainians are far more likely to welcome Jewish neighbors. And what does this chart actually say? When asked, would you accept Jews as fellow citizens, only 5% of Ukrainians said no. That is the smallest number of any of these states. Russia, 14%, Lithuania, 23%, Romania, 22%. Those are serious issues. Poland, 18%. But I wonder if the United States would even come close to that 5% number. That's pretty remarkable. The election of Volodymyr Zelensky was not a one-off phenomenon. This is something that is really demonstrative of Ukrainian society as a whole, and I hope to demonstrate in the next few minutes why that might be so. One thing that's very important to understand about Ukraine as a nation is that it's been bifurcated for much of its history. Not exactly down the middle geographically, but culturally very much so. The western parts of Ukraine, concentrate in the region known as Galicia or Halichina, has always been very much oriented towards Europe, whereas the center east of the country has been more oriented towards Russia. And throughout its long history, Ukraine has kind of vacillated between, do they balance more heavily towards European models of thinking, or do they balance themselves more towards Russian ways of thinking? There is a clear distinction in so many ways. This kind of balance between East and Western ways of thinking really begins to find pragmatic expression in the late 19th and especially the 20th centuries, when you have an era of national awakening that affects much of the region, and Ukrainians themselves have to sort of say, okay, well, what are we? What do we believe? Who are we like? We see this in particular in the revolutionary era, that is after the fall of the Russian Empire in 1917. As Ukrainians attempted to articulate an actual political organization, they found it was essential for them to forge relationships and alliances with the Jewish minority. The Jews had a lot of advantages that Ukrainians did not have at the time. Jews were overwhelmingly urban and literate and numerate, were a lot more conversant with the types of work that was necessary to actually create an administrative apparatus, skills that were not necessarily well developed in the far more agrarian, rural population of Ukrainians. And so the smaller number of Ukrainians who were urbanized and educated, literate, and so on, they formed these alliances in an organization called the Centralna Rada, the Central Soviet would be one way to translate it, or the Central Council, which was distinct from the Soviet councils to the north in Russia. In fact, Russia would invade Ukraine in 1918, and that would begin a civil war between Russians and Ukrainians, a civil war because they were originally both part of the Russian Empire, that would ultimately result in much of Ukraine, although not the western part, being conquered by the Russians. But during this brief period of collaboration, which was actually the subject of my PhD dissertation, the Ukrainians and Jews established a remarkable level of cooperation that was kind of Zelenskyan in its scope. They had a Ministry of Jewish Affairs, they had money printed in Yiddish, they had correspondence in Yiddish. It was really a remarkable kind of thing. It ended in disaster because ultimately the Ukrainian state, the independent state, was unable to hold back the waves of popular violence that surged across the country. The Soviet invasion, the remnants of various anti-Soviet forces active on Ukrainian territory, and ultimately it simply could not sustain itself. But there was a flash of the possibility for a very brief period of time that we would see later flourishing in the beginning of the 21st century. It was during that time that you really saw expressed, if only for a few months, the orientation towards the West, towards Europe, and its values of modernism, tolerance, multiculturalism, democracy, transparency, and so on. Now, if we focus in on the Soviet period during the 1920s, we see a lot of these things happening, albeit in a fairly restricted form, during the 1920s. This is the era known as Korenizatsiya, a period which was, it's hard to translate that term, it's kind of like indigenization, meaning allowing local cultures to express themselves. This is before Stalin really was able to cement his own power, and so as a result, you see an effervescence of Yiddish, of Ukrainian. You see a lot of new cultural possibilities that begin to, express themselves in all kinds of artistic and cultural venues. It comes to a crashing halt as well in the 1930s when Stalin takes over. This is the era of the Holodomor, the incredibly tragic famine that was artificially engineered by the Soviets that affected so many Ukrainians, millions of Ukrainians. Stalin's ideology called for the repression of all kinds of national expression, and we see this carried through after World War II by Khrushchev and Brezhnev, really up until the final years of the Soviet Empire. Now, if we move to the Nazi period, this is obviously, in terms of Jewish-Ukrainian relations, the darkest period of their interaction. So what exactly happened during this time? Well, again, I would refer you to other videos on my channel where I discuss this. It requires a lot more elucidation to understand properly. But basically, the Nazis were able to capitalize through very effective propaganda a widespread anti-Semitic sentiment that was especially present in the area that Professor Snyder calls the Bloodlands. That is, those regions that were temporarily controlled by the Soviets between 1939 and 1941. The Nazis were able to really capitalize on the local anti-communist sentiment by specifically playing up the idea of the Judo-Kommune, the Jewish communist conspiracy, which was also a farce. The idea that communism was dominated by Jews, which was certainly not true, especially after Stalin purged so many Jews from the party. The Nazis were able to direct a lot of the anger with communism against the local Jewish population. The Nazis enlisted the help of local populations, not just Ukrainians, but also Poles, Lithuanians, and Latvians, really the entire area of the Bloodlands, to react against the Soviets by attacking the local Jewish population, however unfair that was. And it was during this time that the so-called Holocaust of bullets took place, when the Nazis used primarily firing squads to destroy the little Jewish Stettlach that dotted the population. Perhaps as many as 2.5 million Jews were killed in these, the most notorious of which occurred in Babyn Yar in the middle of Kiev, where 33,000 Jews were killed in the space of a few days. The Nazis would go on to use Babyn Yar for many months afterwards and killed upwards of 100,000 people, at this point including lots of non-Jewish Ukrainians. But during this time where you have a minority of the population who are Hilfswillige, you also have a minority of the population who are later recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous Gentiles, who are also cognizant of the local ties that they had with their Jewish neighbors and protected them from the Nazis. So there's a lot more to say about this. It's a very complex situation. Perhaps I'll just say one last thing. One of the heroes of this period is a remarkable clergyman named Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, who was the leader of the Ukrainian Catholic Church in the West. He was actually very friendly with Jewish populations before the war. He actually mastered Hebrew. One of my first scholarly articles was a translation of some of his Hebrew language correspondence written in his own hand. And during the war, he directed his network of monasteries and convents to save some 200 Jewish children. He was definitely very pro-Jewish. Yet at the same time, he conferred a blessing on the Waffen-SS division that was made up of Ukrainians called the Galicia Division. And like people have said, how is that possible that he could convey a blessing on an SS division? So we should understand that the Ukrainians who joined that division were largely thinking of themselves as the first Ukrainian division, that they were going to use the Nazi support in order to fight against the Soviets. That was the overwhelming mentality. So there's a lot more to say than I can in this short video, but it's complicated. It's not at all straightforward. Someone with undeniable moral fortitude. Sheptytsky also, by the way, complained to the Pope himself, saying, why are you silent? Why? Saying we need more support for the Jews. We need, to have a stronger voice that condemns this violence. But even he could see value in Ukrainians joining the Nazis to fight against the Soviets. So it's complicated. After the war, and this is the period that's especially relevant for Zelensky's parents, there's tremendous repression of both Ukrainians and Jews who are striving to express their national identities. It was like incredibly dangerous to study anything Jewish, to promote Ukrainian ideas, and to talk about certain Ukrainian historical figures or even historical periods. And this is the era when there was tremendous amount of dissidents who were arrested and sent off to the Gulag, sent off to prison camps in Siberia. It is ironically at this time when a new kind of Ukrainian Jewish rapprochement is forged specifically by that generation of dissidents. People like Anatoly Sharansky, the so-called Shestidesiatniki, the 60s generation was extremely important. And when this began to thaw, particularly under Gorbachev, then there was a tremendous upswelling of support for national expression by both Jews and Ukrainians, and mutual expressions for each other's support. This is happening not just in Ukraine, but also in Poland and in Belarus to a certain degree, especially in the Baltic states. And a lot of these regions, the former bloodlands, are beginning to communicate with each other and to leapfrog over each other to make more and more demands for what Gorbachev would call glasnost, or openness, and even perestroika, reconstruction of the Soviet Union. Ultimately, the Soviet Union is unable to withstand the growth of this nationalist feeling, and in 1989 it goes into a period of collapse. 1991, Ukraine becomes independent along with the Baltic states and so on. And that's when Jewish life really flourishes. This is when Zelensky himself is just a teenager. There's tremendous development in, for example, Dnipropetrovsk, which has this remarkable center, which claims to be, it could be, the largest Jewish complex anywhere in the world, the Menorah Cultural and Business Center. You can see here it has some remarkable architecture that's designed to evoke a 7-branched candelabrum called a menorah, which is associated with the ancient temple in Jerusalem. I've been there. It's a remarkable place. The community there in Dnipropetrovsk, sometimes abbreviated to Dnipro, because well, originally it was named Yekaterinoslav, but they said that's too hard to pronounce, so they switched it to Dnipropetrovsk, and I think Dnipro is even a little bit easier. But a tremendous effervescence of the Jewish population there, and Zelensky is coming of age in an era when there's so many possibilities for Jews. At any rate, let us return to the present moment. You know, I'm uncomfortable speaking about contemporary events because I study in the Department of History. The Department of Prophecy was down the hall, and they seemed a lot smarter than I was. But I do want to take this moment to once again express my concern for Volodymyr Zelensky, an incredibly heroic figure who is determined to remain with his people in Kyiv. He is really, like his namesake, a servant of the people. And I'd like to conclude with a sentiment that, you know, you'll hear the expression right now. People say, Slava Ukraini, like glory to Ukraine. And then the response is Heroyam Slava, glory to the heroes. This itself is a beautiful phrase, but it has a bit of a complex history. It predates the Holocaust. It goes back to the great poet of Ukraine, Taras Shevchenko, and it was used during the revolutionary period at the beginning of the 20th century, but it was also really capitalized by some of the much more pro-Nazi groups during World War II. So it's a complex kind of phrase and hard for me to really say it with full enthusiasm. But what I can say is it's remarkable to see, as a Twitter colleague of mine posted online recently, this t-shirt worn by a man in a cafe in Lviv, which is also pronounced Lviv in western Ukraine. It says Kavod zu Ukraina, you know, glory to Ukraine in Yiddish. And to that I can clearly say Kavod zu Giborim, glory to the heroes. Thank you very much for watching. Let us hope that the Russian advance is halted and that a ceasefire is declared and that the people of Ukraine should be safe along with their remarkable leader, Volodymyr Zelensky. Thank you very much for watching.